This was restricted airspace near the White House, so they couldn't get too close. Somebody said Mayor Monroe was on his way. Gary had bigger prey in mind. He had demanded to see the president. Otherwise, he'd kill the two children. Traffic on Pennsylvania Avenue and the intersecting streets was already backed up as far as I could see. Several drivers and other passengers were deserting their vehicles, leaving them on the street. Scores of them stayed to watch the spectacle, though. Millions now watched on television. "You think he's heading for the White House?" Sampson asked. "I know a few states he'd probably carry," I said. I talked to the police SWAT team leader behind the barricades. I told him I thought Gary Sinigi Murphy was ready to go down in flames. He offered to light the match. A negotiator was already at the scene. He was more than willing to hand over the honor to me. I was finally going to negotiate a settlement with Sinigi Murphy. "We get the chance." Sampson grabbed me and spoke very directly. "We're going to pop him. Nothing tricky, Alex." "Tell that to him," I said to Sampson. "But if you get the chance, hit him. Do him." I wiped my face several times on my sleeve. I was sweating bullets. I was also nauseated and dizzy. I had an electric bullhorn, and I flicked the power on. The power was in my hands. I want to be somebody, too. Was that true? Was that what it had finally come to? "This is Alex Cross," I called out. A few wise guys in the crowd cheered. Mostly it got very quiet on the downtown D.C. street. A burst of wild gunfire suddenly erupted across the street. Loud noise. Car windows blew out all over Pennsylvania Avenue. He did an amazing amount of damage in just a few seconds. Nobody was hurt that I could see. The two children were unharmed. "Hi, back at you, Gary." Then a voice came from across the street. Gary's voice. He was shouting at me. It was just the two of us. Was that what he wanted? His own high noon in the middle of the Capitol? Live national TV coverage? "Let me see you, Dr. Cross. Come on out, Alex. Show your pretty face to everybody." "Why should I?" I spoke over the bullhorn to Sinigi. "Don't even think about it," Sampson whispered from behind me. "You do, I'll shoot you myself." There was another explosion of gunfire from across the avenue. This one went on even longer than the first burst. Washington was starting to look like downtown Beirut. Cameras whirred and clicked everywhere. I stood up suddenly and came out from behind a police sedan. Not too far, just enough to get killed. Some more assholes at the scene cheered me on. "The TV stations are here, Gary," I shouted. "They're filming this now. They're filming me as I stand here. I'm gonna wind up as the big star. Slow start, but a hell of a finish for me." Sinigi Murphy started to laugh. His laughter went on for a while. Was he manic? Depressive? "You finally got me figured out?" he shouted at me. "Have you? Do you know who I am now? Do you know what I want?" "I doubt it. I know that you're hurt. I know you think you're dying. Otherwise—" I stopped to make this sound as dramatic as it would be to him. "Otherwise, you wouldn't have let us catch you again." Directly across Pennsylvania Avenue, Sinigi Murphy stood up behind the bright red Jeep. Both children lay on the sidewalk behind him. Neither seemed to be hurt so far. Gary took a theatrical bow in my direction. He looked like the all-American boy, just as he did in court. I was walking toward him now, getting closer and closer. "Nice touch," he called to me. "Well said, but I'm the star." He suddenly shifted his gun in my direction. A shot rang out behind me. Gary Sinigi Murphy flew back in the direction of the shoe repair shop. He landed on the sidewalk, then rolled over. Both young hostages started to scream. They scrambled up and ran away. I sprinted as fast as I could across Pennsylvania Avenue. "Don't shoot," I yelled. "Hold your fire." I turned and saw Sampson standing there. His service revolver was still aimed at Gary Murphy. He turned the revolver up toward the sky. He kept his eyes on me. He'd finished it for both of us. Gary lay in a crumpled heap on the sidewalk. A stream of bright red blood flowed steadily from his head and mouth. He wasn't moving. The automatic rifle was still clutched in his hand. I reached out and took the gun away first. I heard cameras clicking away behind us. I touched his shoulder. "Gary?" Very carefully I turned the body over. There was still no movement, no sign of life. He looked like the all-American boy again. He'd come to this party as himself, as Gary Murphy. As I looked down, Gary's eyes suddenly opened and rolled back. He looked straight up at me. His lips parted slowly. "Help me," he finally whispered in a soft, choked voice. "Help me, Dr. Cross. Please help me." I knelt down close beside him. "Who are you?" I asked him. "I'm Gary. Gary Murphy," he said. Checkmate. Epilogue. Frontier Justice, 1994. When the fateful day finally arrived, I couldn't sleep, not even a couple of hours. I couldn't play the piano out on our porch. I didn't want to see anyone to talk about what was going to happen in just a few hours. I slipped in and kissed Damon and Janny while they slept. Then I left the house around 2 in the morning. I arrived at Lorton Federal Prison at 3. The marchers were back, carrying their homemade placards under a moonlit sky. Some were singing protest songs from the 1960s. Many prayed. There were several nuns, priests, ministers. A majority of the protesters were women, I noticed. The execution chamber at Lorton was a small, ordinary room with 3 windows. One window was reserved for the press. One was for official observers from the state. The third window was reserved for friends and family of the prisoner. There were dark blue curtains over each of the 3 windows. At 3:30 in the morning, a prison official opened them one by one. The prisoner was finally revealed, strapped down on a hospital gurney. The gurney had a makeshift extension panel for the left arm. Jessie had been staring up at the room's ceiling, but she became alert and seemed to tense as 2 technicians walked to the gurney. One of them carried the needle on a stainless steel hospital tray. The insertion of the catheter needle was the only physical pain involved, if the execution by lethal injection was done correctly. I had been coming out to Lorton to visit both Jessie and Gary Murphy for several months. I was on leave from the D.C. police force, and although I was writing this book, I had plenty of time for visits. Gary appeared to be coming apart. It was in all his workup reports. He spent most days lost in his complex fantasy world. It became harder and harder to coax him back to the real one. Or so it appeared. And that saved him another trial. That saved him from the possibility of death row. I was certain that he was playing games, but nobody wanted to listen. I was sure he was making up another plan. Jessie had agreed to talk to me. We had always been able to talk. She wasn't surprised the state had gotten the death penalty for her and Charles Chakley. She was responsible for the death of the son of the Secretary of the Treasury, after all. She and the Secret Service men had kidnapped Maggie Rose Dunn. They were responsible for Michael Goldberg's death, and also Vivian Kim's. Jessie and Devine had murdered the Florida pilot, Joseph Denyo. Jessie told me that she felt remorse, and had from the very beginning. But not enough to stop me. Something must have broken inside me along the way. I'd probably do the same thing today. I'd take that kind of chance for $10 million. So would a lot of people, Alex. It's the age of greed, but not for you. How do you know that? I asked her. Somehow I do. You are the Black Knight. She told me that I shouldn't feel bad after it was over. She said the marchers and other protesters angered her. If their child had died, most of them would act a lot differently about this. I felt very bad. I didn't know how much I believed Jessie, but I felt bad. I didn't want to be there at Lorton, but Jessie had asked me to come. There was no one else at the window for Jessie. Not a single person in the world. Jessie's mother had died not long after her arrest. 6 weeks earlier, the former Secret Service agent Charles Chakley had been executed in front of his family. That had sealed Jessie's fate. Long plastic tubes connected the needle in Jessie's left arm to several intravenous drips. The first drip, which had already started, dispensed a harmless saline solution. At a signal from the warden, sodium thiopental would be added to the intravenous. This was a barbiturate used as an anesthetic and to put patients gently to sleep. Then a heavy dose of Pavilon would be added. This would induce death in about 10 minutes. To speed the process, an equal dose of potassium chloride was administered. This drug relaxes the heart and stops its pumping. It would cause death in about 10 seconds. Jessie found my face in her friend's window. She gave a little wave with her fingertips, and she even tried to smile. She had bothered to comb her hair, which was cut short now, but still beautiful. I thought of Maria, and how we hadn't gotten to say goodbye before she died. I thought that this might be a little worse. I wanted to leave the prison so badly, but I stayed. I had promised Jessie I would stay. I always kept my promises. In reality, it was nothing very graphic. Jessie finally closed her eyes. I wondered if any of the lethal drugs had been administered, but I had no way of knowing that. She took a deep breath, and then I saw her tongue drop back in her mouth. That was all there was to the modern execution of a human being. That was the end of the life of Jessie Flanagan. I left the prison and hurried to my car. I was a psychologist and a detective, I told myself. I could take this. I could take anything. I was tougher than anybody. Always had been. My hands were jammed deeply into the pockets of my overcoat. In my right hand, so tightly clutched that it hurt, was the silver comb Jessie had given me, once upon a time. When I got to my car, an ordinary white envelope was stuck under the driver's side wiper. I stuffed it in my coat pocket and didn't bother to open it until I was on my way back to Washington. I thought I knew what it was, and I was right. The thing had sent me a message, up close and personal, in my face. Alex, did she sob and whine and beg for forgiveness before they pricked her? Did you shed a tear? Remember me to the family. I want to be remembered. Always. Son of L. He was still playing his terrible mind games. He always would be. I'd told that to anyone willing to listen. I'd written a diagnostic profile for the journals. Gary Saniji Murphy was responsible for his acts. I felt that he ought to be tried for the murders he committed in Southeast. The families of his black victims ought to have justice and retribution, too. If anyone deserved to be on death row, it was Saniji Murphy. The note told me that he'd found a way to con one of the guards. He'd gotten to somebody inside Lorton. He had another plan. Another 10 or 20-year plan. More of his fantasies and mind games. As I drove toward D.C., I wondered who was the more skilled manipulator, Gary or Jessie. I knew both of them were psychopaths. This country is turning out more of them than any other place on the planet. They come in all shapes and sizes, all races and creeds and genders. That's the scariest thing of all. After I got home that morning, I played some Rhapsody in Blue on the porch. I played Bonnie Raitt's Let's